Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is PAVE's 106th virtual panel, and we are super excited today to have a group of amazing panelists to talk about AVs in the city and how we can co-evolve AVs and urban policy. Our guests today are Greg Rodriguez from Stantec, Sarah Kaufman from the Rudin Center for Transportation at NYU Wagner School, and Dr. Billy Riggs, who is a program director and associate professor from the University of San Francisco. Thank you all so much for being with us today. And we also got a lot of amazing questions from the audience. So thank you all for taking the time to write in. We will try to include as many of those in the conversation as we can, because we really got some great questions and topics. First of all, would love for all of you, I think, do such interesting things. Would love for each of you just to, in a sentence or two, just describe what you do in the AV space and with urban policy. Greg, do you want to go first?
Sure, happy to. Thank you, Tara. Congrats on 106 episodes. That's amazing. Appreciate all the programming you all do, and happy to be here with this group. So my role is I'm the policy and regulatory lead for our smarter mobility team at Stantec. My work on autonomous vehicles ranges from being on the attorney side. I was a practicing attorney before coming to Stantec, primarily working with local governments, state DOTs, and MPOs, and came to Stantec to really merge the regulatory discussion with the implementation side of things. So looking forward to bringing that perspective to this conversation.
Great, thanks for being with us. And Sarah, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you, Tara, and thanks to PAVE for having me today. So I'm here from the Rudin Center for Transportation. We are basically a hub of learning, collaboration, and policy change-making in New York City and beyond. In terms of AVs, we've been looking at this issue from a policy perspective, policy and planning, and what this might mean specifically in New York City and more recently across the United States for a variety of cities.
Fantastic, thank you. And Billy, lastly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, and I guess I'll make one clarification that Billy got promoted recently, so Billy Riggs, full professor, not associate professor. So yeah, I will never get a promotion again in my life. So
apologies.
So I lead the autonomous. No, nobody knows. It's kind of a secret. I lead the autonomous vehicles in the city program at University of San Francisco. Proud member of the advisory board for PAVE. Have worked with both PAVE EU as well as US, and a lot of what I do bridges kind of management and operation of fleets with my recovering self as a city planner and transportation engineer. So a lot of what I'm doing is both operational as well as in the policy space that I think Greg and Sarah operate in. So hopefully I can fill in some of the gaps.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really great combination of voices. So looking forward to the conversation. Sarah, I'm going to ask you to kick us off with the foundation for the discussion. Curious to hear from you what the major trends are that you're seeing in urban policy through the Rudin Center's research, and also what the biggest challenges are that city leaders are trying to address.
Sure, thank you. So as I mentioned last year at the Rudin Center, we focused on bringing AVs to New York City through a series of stakeholder working groups. And we looked at how AVs might comport with New York City's broader goals of safety, sustainability, equity, and innovation. And I think those are pretty universal goals for many US cities. And at the same time, many cities share similar challenges, including resources, challenge of being under-resourced, extreme weather, reckless behavior by drivers and other entities. So looking at that combination, we developed 7 mobility principles with this stakeholder working group. I'm not going to list all 7, but a few that stand out. The first is really engaging New York's diverse communities, bringing voices, especially those that were historically under amplified, bringing them to the surface, and also building trust and familiarity. Secondly, coexisting with public transportation. Obviously in New York, public transportation is the lifeblood of the city. And so it's essential that any new service be a complement, not a competition to public transportation. And then third, helping to foster and accommodate new intelligent interactions with the city. So not just developing new technologies and vehicles in a vacuum, but rather interacting with the city in a smart way, whether that's the built environment or everyday people. Those are just some of the recommendations, and I'll drop the link to the report in the chat. But now we're broadening this perspective to what are the challenges that are universal to cities across the United States. And obviously New York is different from other cities in a lot of ways, but what are the universal challenges, and what might AVs, the introduction of AVs mean across the board? So we're developing that in partnership with Neuro, and hopefully we will release that very soon, and I will be glad to share it with the audience.
Fantastic, thank you. And Billy, also another unique city from your vantage point is San Francisco. And being an AV researcher at the University of San Francisco, you probably have the advantage of seeing AVs probably almost every day on the road in their native habitat. Curious how that has influenced your research.
Yeah, AVs in the wild. Well, it's interesting to be, as a researcher, in the hotbed of kind of the innovation ecosystem. It's part of what drew me back to San Francisco. My history, I was a professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo before I came back to the University of San Francisco. And I came back to kind of lead this focus on AVs around 2016, when I think, many of us weren't talking about this, and definitely been able to see this evolution to where now we're seeing level 4 vehicles, true level 4 vehicles out on the roadways in San Francisco, particularly with the deployments from Cruise and Waymo. And we could talk a little more about the kind of the regulatory approach about that later. But I think first off, how it's influenced my thinking is I've been really moving away from these traditional ways of talking about SAE standards. Because really what we're talking about is being able to operate at level 4 within a specified ODD. And I make a really clear bifurcation now in terms of what we're seeing with like Tesla Autopilot and level 2. Let's just call it a level 2 vehicle. Let's not even go there. Make a bifurcation, because that's in terms of what we're seeing in terms of all the positive outcomes that Sarah talked about. That's a different discussion. ADAS, advanced driving assist software, is a different discussion in terms of, I think, what will benefit in terms of our society in terms of safety, and what will benefit our society in terms of equitable service. And I know Ellen Partridge actually has already said she wants to talk about equitable service, and I want to talk about expanded service. But I think it's a real opportunity to rethink our systems, both from a network standpoint and from a service standpoint and from a platform standpoint. And so what I've been able to do with a lot of these companies is do actual rider pilot. And I think we have like some of the first of kind actual rider studies, not just kind of the let's put people in an Uber and pretend that they're we'll pretend that that's actually going to be their behavior in an AV. So we have some interesting results about that. And we're also seeing, like, I know there's been a lot of sensationalism about kind of corner cases, particularly in the Bay Area. And as much as I heart my friend Dave Zipper, like a lot of the stuff that has been written are actually cases of policy friction, where, for example, commercial vehicles can double park when there's not available curb. And if you've been to San Francisco, a curb cut is not an available curb. So I think there's some stuff there that are real policy issues that, when you abut urban operations of fleets, they're things that we can really talk about, and we shouldn't sensationalize the corner case. We could work on the policy and the pragmatic operational solution. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. And Greg, you talk a lot about collaboration. You work with communities across the country to build consensus about testing and deployment, to facilitate community input. What have you learned about how the public and city leaders perceive AVs?
Thanks, Tara. Thanks to Billy and Sarah for their work and leadership on this issue. I think this is a great panel again with these different perspectives and disciplines as well, which I think need to be in the room in order to get this right, to your question around collaboration. So I think what we've seen at the federal, state, and local level is there's this tremendous amount of interest around technology and how to harness its potential. Unfortunately, I think there's a lack of understanding around how the technology works, and then perhaps going a little bit deeper, how the technology aligns with specific use cases for its integration. So I think, again, what we see a lot in the news is this conversation around passenger vehicles, robo-taxis. Perhaps what isn't in the news as much is the opportunities around goods movement, the opportunity for those suburban, rural connections. And I do think it leads to this conversation around land use. And I think really thinking about, to Billy's point, how we rethink the system and how it operates is this huge opportunity for collaboration. I would argue that decision makers are stuck in the status quo because the status quo is easy. Every time we think about wanting to harness transformational change, even around electrification, we go back and try and fit things into these traditional silos. And I think right now we do have this opportunity to move past those silos, because when you think about an opportunity around something like community charging hubs, it blends this opportunity around transportation, energy, and even shared mobility. When you think about the use of these community charging hubs to not only charge personal vehicles, but also the Amazons and postal fleets of the world are going to be transitioning to electric, and then hopefully integrating them to neuro vehicles as well. And I do think we need to talk about infrastructure. I've come around to say, I think about the field of dreams. If we build it, they will come. I do think if we have the right investment in the infrastructure to support these technologies, we will see quicker adoption. And an example of that in my mind is mobility hubs, and how do we harness that, again, to think about it within the multimodal transportation network perspective. So I'll stop there. I think you're on mute, Tara.
Apologies. Thank you. Just to stick with infrastructure for a minute, we got a lot of audience questions about the infrastructure topic. Actually, a couple of them were really about funding and how, like, for example, one from the audience was, how should a city's infrastructure investment change with the adoption of AVs? Do we see this happening? What practical infrastructure investments can a city make that would help AVs the most? These are questions we get all the time, actually, from the audience. I'm curious, with all of your experience in this area, your thoughts on it. Anybody want to take a first stab at that?
I have a kind of a canned answer I give every time.
Sure.
Signs, lines, and potholes. I mean, literally, I think you can never go wrong with, with better signs, better lines, and a road that's not going to destroy somebody's drivetrain. And but I think if you really double click on what Greg emphasized, more and more, I'm seeing, we are seeing not only the opportunity for automated shared fleets, but also electric fleets or clean fuel fleets. We just call that. And we are going to see a tension with regard to charging infrastructure with fleets. You can't, even with bus operations, you can't charge 200 electric buses overnight at one depot. And this is actually, if you actually look at this from a fundamental standpoint, this is actually a grid sophistication issue that is way beyond our discussion today. And I think we're right to elevate it. I'm not the right person in the room to provide insights on that, but I do know that from an operational standpoint, if we want to reduce, it's not the same as deadheading, but if we want to reduce wasted VMT, and I call inefficient VMT, from returning to charging depots, we need to think about whatever the platform looks like, whether or not it's a shuttle or a robotaxi, a lightweight automated vehicle, we need to think about distributed charging infrastructure.
Absolutely. Sarah, and we also got a couple questions about equity. And curious about your thoughts. For example, how can city leaders work with AV companies to advance equity? And are there specific metrics or guidelines that can inform more equitable deployment?
Yeah, so on your first question and on the previous one, I'm going to push back on the premise and say, to what extent should we really expect cities to invest at this point in infrastructure and capabilities specifically for AVs? So Billy brought up the great example of, signs, lines, and potholes. And those are great examples of things that cities should invest in regardless of what vehicles are entering the picture. Cities need to be organizing the curb space a little more intelligently, and that should happen regardless of whether people are being picked up by a robo-taxi or a human-driven taxi or whatever activity is happening. So cities do need to build out infrastructure in a smarter way, and at the same time, AV companies need to be equal partners in helping advance those technologies to be more accommodating to the AVs. In terms of equity, there are a lot of examples of regulations where cities are requiring rides either by taxis or rideshare or even electric scooters in historically underserved areas or areas that are underserved by transit. That's one way of doing it. Another way is developing workforce development programs in underserved communities to develop a direct line between places like high schools and community colleges to give them a path to employment in these companies and teach them things like coding that they may not have access to otherwise. Also hearing out the voices of different communities while establishing requirements and goals for the entire city. So there are a few different ways. And of course, accessibility falls under equity, and ensuring that services are accessible by users with a variety of needs and abilities. That is key to a public-private partnership that would be successful.
For sure. Greg also wanted to talk to you about what opportunities are there to integrate AVs into existing public transit networks? How can we, kind of use what we already have and forward this technology?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So kind of maybe building off the previous two and then going into that one, I do think Sarah makes a good point around kind of right-sizing your investments as the technology matures. So in a lot of our work, even around electrification, we're trying to tell cities don't feel paralyzed. It's not like you have to do everything at once. You already have a transportation planning process. So just think of a way to integrate these technologies in an incremental way that then supports your overall goals. Don't shy away from your overall transportation goals. Help influence how the technology gets developed. And I think, three terms we use a lot in our studies right now are future ready, adaptable, and multimodal. And I think that then leads into your question around how can you think about ways to make sure they're being integrated into transit? I will say it's a complicated question, mainly because you have a funding issue around whether or not the use of private services for transit can use federal funding. That usually requires a partnership. Okay. But in order for transit agencies to engage in that partnership, you need to be conscious and proactively dealing with some of the labor concerns, which I don't think should be concerns, because it's not like we're going to take away operators from the vehicles. There still is going to be a role for labor in automation as it comes to transit. And I think, the work that VIA and May Mobility are doing, both on microtransit and on incorporating AV ride sharing and incorporating AVs into transit, I think is a great model to continue to work towards. I do think an important component of that will be the coordination with the public. So I think we've all seen, Kansas City launched Bridge on the microtransit side, and that was that didn't go well because I think people didn't even understand the services were available and how to use them. So we need to be thinking collaboratively about how to bring people along and make sure they're aware of how these technologies are being implemented and used.
Absolutely. I also want to be sure we talk for a little bit about policy. Obviously, urban policy isn't created in a vacuum, and it's important to consider how urban policy is influenced by both state and federal policies. Sarah, wanted to talk to you first. New York City is probably the best example of the push and pull between city and state officials, and even the federal government, since the city has been trying for years to implement congestion pricing. What can federal and state governments do to help support cities in realizing the benefits of autonomous vehicles?
Sure. Well, we could have a whole webinar on that topic, but just as some examples, I think federal government already does and can strengthen safety regulations for vehicles. For example, and Greg can probably talk more about this, but the design of vehicles for safety and especially trucks is key to ensuring safety in cities, and that's a federal regulation. States also can invest in new technology developments, research and development programs that are outside of the scope of what cities can do, but really would benefit cities statewide. And then on both of those fronts, both the federal and state governments can continue to and should increase funding of public transportation, which really is the most efficient way to move people around cities. And funding those is key to getting people around cities cheaply and effectively.
Sure. And Billy, want to look at your state of California has one of the most complex regulatory structures with both the California DMV and the California Public Utilities Commission overseeing different aspects of AV operations. What are your thoughts about the appropriate approach to state regulation?
Well, before I go there, I want to kind of highlight, I think one thing Sarah emphasized is funding the service is complicated, because funding doesn't exist for a lot of our legacy transportation services. We know we're nearing fiscal cliff for many of them. So, I see this idea of complementary services, rethinking the way we deliver services is a huge opportunity, harnessing private sector innovation to maybe deliver services more cost effectively. And is a real big opportunity for automated vehicles going in the future. There are a lot of use cases right now, actually, a lot of use cases, public transit use cases in Europe. But there's great examples of how Monrovia in Southern California had a program, for example, that actually used Uber and Lyft as a complementary service to the transit system. And I think it's actually something, Cincinnati has done similar stuff. I think there's a number of case studies in the US that could be complementary, particularly in these hard to fund use cases like paratransit, accessible transit. So it's something to keep in mind as we go forward. In terms of California regulatory policy, it's kind of a hard pivot. But I think it's the Wild West, and we have kind of some policy fragmentation. Clearly, a lot of this policy is based on kind of the policy preemption model that was established post kind of rideshare, Uber and Lyft 2012. And so we saw this evolution of policy preemption at the state level around 2012 to 2014. And we saw gradually, state by state, that states decided they would regulate rideshare. There are pros and cons to that. I think what we've seen in California is a really robust regulatory process that is beautifully imperfect. It is a way of having consistent regulatory process across the state, across geographies that have very different built form, very different land use, but having consistent rules about how you actually can regulate the driving function. So for example, that's in California with the DMV, but also the rideshare function, the ability to carry passengers and to do so safely. And so California has a very sophisticated way of doing that. It's been replicated in other states, although other states have different, levels of regulation that are required. But I think it's one of those things where a lot of people, they read stuff in the news about like San Francisco commented this or LA commented that. It's a part of the policy process in California to have this really public dialogue about the corner cases. And I think that's a really important thing to realize is about that when you read about, an Uber or Waymo or Waymo, I guess we can say Uber Waymo now, a Waymo or a Cruise that for example is having an interaction with a person from emergency management, and there's been some dialogue about this. You realize that like that is actually a discussion that has to happen for us to actually be able to surface some of the corner cases, and particularly some of this we've been able to see private sector companies and cities dialogue and change some of the operational procedures because of the California policy process. So, I tend to think this policy preemption is a good thing. And Sarah's right to actually mention like elevating safety standards at the federal level has actually been a great thing as well, to emphasize the opportunity, but also to explore these new vehicle types with FMVSS. But I think if we could actually start to evolve, to come to realize it's like this idea that we can have this very public dialogue about kind of things like data sharing and things like how we need to engage emergency management officials in these kind of, those are the kinds of things that we need to continue to dialogue, because they're really important regardless of whether or not it's a robotaxi or whether or not it's an Uber or Lyft.
Absolutely. And so obviously California is sort of at a different place than a lot of states, but Greg, you did a recent project looking at a lot of states in the Northeast and how to prepare states for AVs. Curious if you can talk about your findings and what that project was.
Yeah, no, at a very high level, I mean, it was very interesting. This project was looking to develop a coordinated regulatory approach to allowing the operation of AVs across state lines. Fantastic goal, but very complicated when you think about the different political structures across states, concerns around authority that you may be giving up if you were to have, let's say, a coordinated regional entity that is approving all AVs operating in the Northeast region. So essentially, I think somebody just put the report in the chat, but we came up with an approach just starting with coming up with an MOU to try to align the use of resources around a common goal for the region, mainly to encourage industry to come and start a dialogue, to work on a streamlined process while still considering complicated issues like safety, public engagement, and data sharing, as Billy mentioned. And I think, one takeaway to be thinking about, again, going back to this word of the status quo, I think we do need to have a conversation around how roles and responsibilities will change once we get to level 4 or level 5. I don't think anybody expects a level 4 or level 5 vehicle to be able to pass a driving test at the state level. And that's a big change that states may not agree with. And it may then move within the jurisdiction of NHTSA. And then who's going to be checking, whether or not the right software updates are in there. And again, it's how do we evolve in a way that tracks the technology evolving. And again, one of my biggest concerns is we're talking about the technology as if it's here and fully implemented without thinking about the path to get there from a policy and regulatory perspective. And in my mind, a big way to do that is more pilot projects across the country, analyzing data, and then actually putting into practice this term data-driven regulation.
That's fantastic. And sadly, I just realized we are out of time. This always goes too fast, and I feel like we could have about 4 more hours on these topics alone. But thank you all so much for joining us today and for your thoughtful comments. We will find times to keep this conversation going. It's a really good group. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. And you can get more information at our website, pavecampaign.org. Thank you all.
Thank you.